Welcome to the How Do I Become podcast. I'm your host, Chris Gouveia. In today's episode, we'll be exploring how do I become a construction manager. Thanks for listening. All right, well, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome one of my good friends and a respected construction manager, Alejandro Villagomez. He's been working in the construction industry for a little bit over 15 years, but most recently with Level 10 Construction here in the Bay Area. So, Alex, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, start with just telling me, what does a construction manager do?
It varies a little bit, but for the most part, my main responsibility is the project schedule and budget. So that's the most simplest way of looking at it. I'm responsible for building the project on time and within budget.
Okay, great. And these projects that you're overseeing, these are pretty large scale projects. Can you give me a couple examples of kind of the size and scale of projects that you're working on and overseeing?
Yeah, so currently I've been working on about $80 million, about 9-story building, and that's actually just what we call a warm shell. So it's basically all the structure, the exterior, and all the air conditioning systems, and that's it. There's no actual offices or anything interior wise that's open. So if you go into the building, it's actually wide open on each floor, but all the main building infrastructure is installed. So, there's electrical available and there's air conditioning in the middle that you can tap into depending on, office spaces that you
Hmm.
build. And so basically, this is a spec project for a developer that has built the whole campus. So the whole campus itself is about $600 million,
Wow.
and that actually includes 6 towers. And this is the last of the 6 towers being built. The other five have already been completed, and actually the interiors have been leased and built, and they all belong to one of our high tech clients. We say it's confidential because they don't like to their name out there in the media, but it's one of the large tech companies in the Bay Area. And so what they did is they actually leased the whole campus from the developer even before it was completely built. And and then after that, they have the choice. They can either use Level 10, who built the whole campus, or
Oh,
they
I
can
see.
actually look for a different company to build the interiors. So out of the 6 towers, this is the only tower we're scheduled to do the interiors for them. And then a couple years ago, I actually finished the event center for them on the same campus. They used to have a what they call the amenities building, and that's where they have basically all the amenities like gym, swimming pool, let's see, meditation, saunas, all that stuff that serve the campus.
Hmm.
They're like, oh, we need a not kind of like a convention center that they can use. They actually didn't have one in the Bay Area, so they went ahead and remodeled this brand new building and turned it into a big convention center, basically for their campus.
And what was the size and scale of that convention center?
So that one's about 28,000 square feet, which is it's a pretty good size one, but not quite as big as like Apple's spaceship theater per se. This one only holds about 700 people,
Wow.
uh, to capacity, whereas I think Apple's holds like 1,000 and more, and so that's a pretty good size.
And what was the budget on that project?
That one ended up being $20 million. I mean, keep in
Hmm.
mind that's just for the remodel. The building itself had already been built, and that was
Sure.
another like 25 million. So
Yeah, these are large scale projects for sure. When working on that type of project, are you the one person overseeing, or you're part of a team or a fleet of people overseeing this project and the budget? Kind of how does that work?
yeah, it varies, from project to project, but on this particular one, the overall campus did involve, let's see, about four different project managers,
Hmm.
and overseeing us was one of our vice presidents.
Okay.
So level 10 has about six vice presidents that they kind of take responsibility on different clients. But then on smaller projects, like when I did the interiors or the remodel on that convention center, I was in charge of that one basically, and I just reported to a vice president.
Okay.
Uh, he wasn't really involved on day to day. I basically ran the whole thing with very little input.
Okay, great. Give me a little bit more insight into your day to day because you said you're overseeing, schedule, timeline, and budget. Can you give me a little bit of the details of the day to day and kind of what you're overseeing? Maybe that's working with the city and the county. Maybe that's working with the actual people doing the work. But just give me some insight about that.
Yeah, no problem. My day to day, for the most part, involves meetings. So there's a lot of meetings involved, whether it's clients, my own team. Basically, my main job is to make sure that all the materials are on site before or when the field team needs them.
Mm-hmm.
So on the field side, there's another person that we call a superintendent. That's basically like my equivalent in the office side,
Mm-hmm.
and their responsibility is to install those materials. So
Right.
I have to make sure that I'm contracting with we call them subcontractors. So the subcontractors can be anything from an excavation company, a plumbing company, a drywall
Sure.
company, and then my job is to make sure I write those contracts, that everything falls within the budget, that they deliver the whether it's the labor to install or the materials when they're supposed to be here, so that we don't get delayed on the schedule. The way we accomplish that is through different meetings. So I'll run whether it's scheduling meeting, a budgeting meeting, a staff meeting. The other big meeting that we usually have is called the OAC, which stands for Owner Architect Contractor,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
and that's an on where we have the best opportunity to interface with our client and the designer, and that's a pretty standard setup. Sometimes we'll have a design build project where we're actually in charge of the architect, and then we're basically just interfacing as one unit with the client. That's a lot more rare though, but for the most part, there's a design party, an architect, and then the client.
Okay.
So we'll coordinate with them and we'll review, hey, where's the project on the schedule? How are we doing with the budget? Are there any changes, or do we have any problems getting permits with the city
Mm-hmm.
or county, like you mentioned? One example is when we build cafeterias, we have to deal with the local city and then also the county, because the county will issue a health permit for the kitchen.
I see.
So depending on the jurisdictions, and then if there's backup generators, you have to coordinate with the Bay Area Air Quality Management Office. If you're close to an airport, you have to deal with the FAA. So there
Wow.
could be a lot of different agencies involved.
Sure.
Uh, for example, on this project, we were building a bridge um, that actually involved like 8 different agencies. There
Wow.
was the VTA. It actually involved AT&T too, because it was really close to one of their main fiber hubs. And then it involved the Santa Clara Bay County Air Water, Water District. So all these different agencies we had to coordinate with for this one small bridge that we had to build, and it can be very difficult to deal with them, because if they all have different requirements, and sometimes those requirements conflict or don't make sense, and then you have to kind of work it out with all of them and figure out how that can get done. So it actually took that was one of the longest parts of this campus I worked on. I mean, it was just crazy how many people were touching that project, even though it wasn't that big. I think it was only like a couple $1 million. um, compared to our other projects on the campus, that was like almost nothing, but it probably took most amount of time and meetings.
Yeah. So you're juggling a lot of balls and a lot of different requirements. So maybe let's take a step back. You received formal education at a university at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. So tell me about what you learned there and kind of how that differs from what you learned in the real world and kind of what that transition was like.
So yeah, I was lucky enough. I got into Cal Poly. It's I probably couldn't get in there now just because it's so hard. But I think one of the reasons Cal Poly is one of the best for construction management is how well it prepares you for the real world.
Mm-hmm.
The motto is "learn by doing," which they definitely encourage. So one of the things that I like is a lot of the professors were actually at one point in the field. So a
Oh
lot of
wow.
them were actually retired construction or architectural people that did really well for themselves, and then decided, okay, I'm going to retire a little early and go into teaching, and spread my knowledge and pass it on to all these young kids. Basically, it's not to say that other schools they're not good, but like you said, it's like, well, did you learn on the job mostly, or did you already have a good um, start? Eventually it evens out quite a bit, but in the beginning for sure it helps a lot, and that's
Yeah,
because of that model that learn by doing. So they actually encourage do internships in the summer. They also have co-ops for where you can go and take a couple classes remotely and work for like 6 to 9 months with a company. And the good thing is that a lot of these companies are eager to take on these kids and as interns or under co-ops and get them get their hands dirty doing the work. And I think that really helps, just because it is a very stressful job, and if you
sure,
don't love it, it's just not going to work out. I think sometimes we see a lot of people that start working in this field and they're like, oh wow, this is not what I expected.
sure. In your experience, because you've been in the construction industry for quite a while, how many people are, formally educated with a bachelor's degree versus kind of just they've been doing different things in the construction industry for quite some time?
So for my position, it's actually pretty common, and I think it's been pretty common that project managers come from a formal university background. In
Okay,
the past, let's say maybe like 30 years ago, before construction management really came to be like a major at universities, a lot of that work was kind of handled by civil engineers
I see.
that they just wore a couple extra hats basically. So there'd be one civil engineer that was helping with design work, but then would also be in charge of project management. And it just found, over time it kind of developed into a specialty, just because projects got more complex.
Right,
There was, civil engineers tend to be more heavy on the engineering side. So there was more complexity in the finances, the scheduling methods, budgeting, and just having to interface with different clients and ever increasing groups of people as the projects became more complex. So on my side, it's very common. Where it's not very common, but has been changing recently, is in the field side.
hmm,
So we have our superintendents, which I mentioned earlier, and
yeah,
they're, like I said, kind of like my equal, but they're out in the field actually getting everything installed. And so in the past, that they've been carpenters. They moved up from apprentice to journeyman, foreman, and eventually some kind of lead, or depending on the company, became superintendents.
right,
And so for them, it was very important that they had that field experience, because what you find out is it seems very easy and straightforward in theory to look at construction, but then when you get out there, there's a lot of nuances and very complicated intricacies to putting things together.
yeah,
Also, the order in which you do it, right, is
right,
very
right,
important. So that's why their field experience was always so important. I find that superintendents tend to be pretty old. I mean, I meet them sometimes, and they've retired a couple times, and they keep coming back just because the demand's so high and their wages are so high that it's like, okay, well, I guess I'll do it. I think also part of that mentality that they have is I always have to keep busy doing something.
hmm,
So I see quite a bit on the older side, sometimes well past retirement age. But what we have seen an uptick is formally educated university students that want to go into the field side,
interesting.
and so that's been trending. So again, as projects have become more complicated and more technology driven, things like using iPads in the field or even enhance virtual reality in the field,
Oh, cool.
we're seeing a lot more young people be excited about working in the field
Yeah,
and helping lead that. So right now, I think that's what the industry's wrestling with, is how do we bridge between those two different worlds of not formally educated, came up through the trades and eventually became the leader of the field, versus coming from a university background and not having any or much experience in the field.
right,
So what we try to do now is kind of pair them with an old type style and have them share that knowledge and pass it on, so that these people coming from university backgrounds can pick up those pieces. And our hope is that in the future they'll be able to take that knowledge on as well and become very good superintendents, basically.
And what would be the educational background for that person at university to become a superintendent, then, trained in the field by you guys?
It's actually very similar to mine. So for the most part, it comes. We get the same degree. It's just you kind of diverge when you start your career. So when you start on my side, you become a project engineer, a construction project engineer. But what we tend to do for the field side is we call them field project engineers. So they're actually more out in the field. They're paired with the superintendent, who is going to show them the ropes, and it'll depend on how long the project is, but they'll have that superintendent for a couple years, sometimes 4 years, depending on the project if it's a really big project. And so we'll try and pair some of our better superintendents that can mentor that field side of them. Whereas I'm in the office and I'm getting mentored by like our vice president and on the operation side. So that's the main difference.
Sure.
There's no like specific field. We are seeing some programs in the trades where they're kind of helping to train people more with technology.
I see.
But unfortunately, I think there's a lot of talk in America that we don't see that very much. Even the shop classes, right? They've kind
Right.
of died away a bit. So we're kind of hoping to see more working with our unions to try and increase outreach and increase people joining the trades, because I'm of the opinion that college is not necessarily for everybody,
Right.
and we definitely should have options for people to be able to make a good wage and a good living.
And like you said, the demand is high for these jobs.
Yes, for sure, and it's only increasing.
And how did you get interested in it?
So I actually always thought I wanted to be an architect growing up, and my dad's always been in construction. When I was a little kid, he always built stuff. He drove heavy equipment. He did build formal projects because we lived on the ranch, and he was one of the caretakers there. His main responsibility was maintenance, so he would maintain the roads, work on pumps and all kinds of stuff like that. But growing up, I thought I wanted to be an architect. I liked CAD and designing houses and that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until as I was getting closer, it was my junior year in high school, and one of the counselors said, "Hey, I just saw this thing at Cal Poly. They have this summer program you can go to, and for architectural college, so you can get a field for what that is." So I ended up going to this summer program at Cal Poly, my junior year summer going into senior year, and so I got a taste. We lived on the dorms, and we got taught by some of the architecture professors at Cal Poly and other students, from across the country that came to this program. So it's a really interesting program. And what I found out is I really didn't have what it takes to be an architect. Because to be an architect is actually a very special thing. Well, one, it's hard to succeed in architecture. I think out of all the architecture graduates, only like 10% of them actually work in architecture.
Oh, wow.
So it's actually, what I found out is more of an artistic notion in, but it's even more. I think to be a good architect is even harder than that, right? Because on top of being an artist, you have to be able to communicate that to an engineer or a client,
Right.
to
Hmm.
design that space. And what that summer program for me, what it did really well is actually show me, you know what, you're not very artistic. Just because the projects they would assign, I was very practical. So they're like, hey, sketch up your dream house, and I'm building
Uh-huh.
like this old Victorian house, and then this guy next to me builds literally a glass cube. And I was like, okay. And then the professor comes by, is like, oh, I love the way you explored the idea of openness and privacy and this and that. And then he looks at mine and he's like, oh yeah, that's very
We've seen
conventional.
that. Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, are you kidding me? Who's gonna live in a glass house? So at that point, that's where I actually realized, like, not sure architecture's for me. And then at the very end, what they did is they actually introduced us to the other colleges. Sorry, the other majors in the College of Architecture,
I
and
see.
one of them was construction management, and that's the first time I ever heard of that. And it's
Yeah.
like, so construction management is basically made up of architecture. It's like one third architecture, one third engineering, and one third business.
Mm,
Because as a construction manager, you kind of have to dabble in all those. You have to know some enough engineering that you can put the different things together, and then you have to be able to enough business that you can communicate with your clients and talk to them about budgets and how it's all going to work out in architecture, because you have to be able to speak to the architects and understand what their desired design intent is. So to me, that actually was very appealing. That's basically exactly what I wanted to do, because I enjoyed kind of dabbling through all these different fields, and I lucked out that way where I was able to find that major, because before then I didn't even know it existed.
right. So now that you've been in this for 15 years, tell me what are the pros and cons of being a project manager, construction manager?
Well, the pros is, like I said, if you love this field and what it's all about, is at the end of the day, it's really amazing to see that whether it was an old building that you tore down or just an open lot, that all of a sudden there's this tower standing there that
Mm-hmm.
you built. I mean, you turned a concept, an idea into a reality.
Right.
And there's something very visceral about seeing that completed, whether it's working in a hospital and seeing it take in patients that are getting treated, and, how all that came together. I mean, some of my most emotional moments is actually when I worked at a children's hospital LA
Mm,
and built it was like a $400 million patient tower extension, and you could see how much care was taken by the design team because it's for children. So,
right.
they would put like little wispy clouds on the ceiling tile.
Yeah.
The flooring was like a special, more colorful, not just your typical sterile type of environment. And that that to me, was very emotional to be able to see that completed and know that, these kids are going through some very tough times are going to be treated there.
Yeah.
So to me, that's what matters the most, is being able to turn a concept or an idea into a reality.
Yeah. It's inspiring. Tell me about some of the cons of being a construction manager.
Yeah, so the cons are sometimes the work week can be very long. Typically 40 hours a week is pretty hard to do. Projects do kind of go up and down. So you're really busy in the beginning, you'll have a little lull, then it gets really busy in the middle, maybe have another lull, and then it's super busy at the end too.
Right.
And it's just part of the gig basically, and you have to spend as many hours as it takes to make sure the project is completed on time. And there really is just anything that could be thrown at you, whether it's from the government, from the weather,
Right.
from
Right.
anything. But at the end, when you're talking about a 4-year project, the client's still expecting that to be done in 4 years. So if you have a really bad year and there's just flooding and flooding, then you're going to be trying to figure out, how do I make up for that time that was lost, or do we need to work extra hours, double shifts, triple shifts, depending on how important the project is.
Right. And within budget.
Correct. And so budget is a big determiner, but a lot of times, sometimes time is money, right, for a client. So they'll be like, okay, we understand the budget's this, but we need to be done earlier, or we need to make up for the time the weather threw at us. So we're going to give you more money to get it done faster, work more shifts and whatnot. So yeah, it's just, to me, that's the downside, is a lot of times you'll be working long hours in the office, and then you don't get to see your kids as much. And you come home and they're asleep. You leave in the morning, they're still asleep, right?
Yeah.
And so that to me is really the biggest downside, that does happen quite a bit. And that's what I meant, that if you're thinking you're going to work 40 hours a week and that's it, then this isn't really the field for you. There are moments where, it comes down a little bit, but for the most part, it's definitely up there. I would say average is like 50 to 60 a week,
Yeah.
and then it can only go up from there.
That dovetails well into my next question, which what are the general lifestyle and salary considerations?
So it depends how you look at it, right? Because it's a salary exempt position, which means you get paid for no real consideration how many hours you put into it,
Okay.
and for the most part, we get paid really well. I will tell you though that the field actually gets compensated even better. Whether
Hmm.
it's our union reps that look out for our tradespeople, or just being a superintendent, where you're part of a dying breed basically and highly sought after. So a superintendent, pretty much in my equal position, actually makes a bit more than I do. But here in the Bay Area, I would say you're making anywhere from like 150 to 200 after maybe 5 or 6 years. Starting's about 85 to 90 right out of
Hmm.
college. So
That's great.
there's a lot of work out there that starts you out like that.
Hmm. And people with your skill set, I mean, I've definitely seen it firsthand because I've asked you for help on my own house. So the skill set that you have definitely applies to DIYers and people that want to do things outside of the 50 to 60 hour work week. Is that correct?
Yes, for sure. They can. To me, it's actually kind of relaxing when I actually get to, you know, practice the craft, right?
Sure.
Just because I'm usually not out in the field building things, we have our field trades people that actually do this all the time. And for me, it actually it's a humbling experience when I actually get to do something, because you realize just how hard it is.
Right.
For me, it's like when I walk by and I see the project moving along day to day, I'm like, oh, that's cool, things moving along, that's awesome. But until you get your hands in there and start using screwing some screws or hammering some hammers, sorry, some nails, you don't realize how much work that is when you do that for 8 to 10 hours a day.
Any tips for people who would be interested in this?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I mean, it's kind of something you have to commit to when you're like in high school, probably.
Mm.
I would say, even if you don't want to go to college, there's definitely a lot of different trades you can go into. If you're really unsure and want to try different things, you can start out with carpentry, and it's just as simple as signing up at the hall. They have a union. I recommend union just because it's a much more formal structure and they provide training. Technically, you could just go to a company and be like, "Hey, I want to be a laborer," start that way. But to get a real formal and eventually, especially here in the Bay Area, end up in commercial projects, you really need to join a union. But like I said, I mean, they've been around for tens of, probably a couple 100 years for the oldest one, uh, and they'll take care of you. They'll make sure you get good benefits, good pay, training, and it's basically a very low upstart cost for you, which is
Right.
pretty much nothing. You just pay your union dues, and if you're motivated, you'll move through it quickly, and you'll keep rising, and eventually you can become a superintendent.
Hmm.
Or if you want to go a more traditional university route, you can go into. I mean, honestly, we hire a lot of civil engineers,
Hmm.
mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, but now it's pretty prevalent that a lot of universities have construction management programs. So you can definitely do that. I think there's been a few, like even community colleges, that offer some certificates
Awesome.
related to that. So especially if you want to go into the field side, you can do a certificate. But you just got to look. I mean, depending on what area you want to go.
All right. Well, Alex, thanks so much. This has been really interesting. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to the How Do I Become podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing on Apple or Spotify podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter or Instagram at How Do I Become One with the number 1. All of our episodes are also posted on YouTube under the channel name How Do I Become.